If you happened to be working for the CIA in the late 1980s, and you happened to be assigned to the USSR, well, you would have had a very exciting job. It would have been quite obvious to you that the Soviet Union was heading somewhere. You couldn't tell where exactly, even though that's what Uncle Sam was paying you for. But you knew that changes were coming. Big changes. Now, while the 60s and 70s had been relatively stable, and the Soviet economy had been growing at a suspiciously consistent pace, in reality, the people of the Soviet Union had plenty of money and nothing to spend it on. The running gag was that workers pretended to work, and the party pretended to pay them. Most of the USSR's production went into supporting the glorious Red Army, leaving the average consumer waiting sometimes years for goods like automobiles and refrigerators. Leonid Brezhnev, the general secretary for most of this period, had ruled on borrowed time, and when he passed away in 1982, his successors were in for a rude reality check. Or they would have been, if they had survived more than a year. Unfortunately, they both died of health complications just a year after assuming office. So the first half of the 1980s saw the USSR without effective leadership. In fact, Ronald Reagan famously complained that he couldn't make any progress with the Russians because they kept dying on him. The Soviets did eventually elect a leader who wasn't terminally ill, our good friend Mikhail Gorbachev, who found himself in a very problematic position. On one side, he had to deal with a younger, more progressive generation of communists that wanted to save the Union by radically reforming it. On the other side, he had to contend with the old Soviet hardliners, who dreamed of returning to the glory days of violent suppression, because nothing solves internal problems quite like imprisoning and torturing your opposition. Ah, those were the days. On the Siberian Railway. Right off the bat, these two factions threatened to tear Gorbachev apart. When the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded in 1986, the hardliners tried to cover it up, only to fail miserably and embarrass the Soviet Union. Gorbachev backtracked and promised political transparency and freedom of speech in a bid to win back the people's trust. He also tried to fix the horrendously broken planned economy by, for example, removing the artificially low price of vodka to stop everyone from being drunk all the time. It's more expensive. Whoa. The problem with that is that you end up with a bunch of hungry, disillusioned Russians who are now also sober enough to organize nationwide strikes, which they do. The hardliners beg Gorbachev to send in the tanks, but he doesn't. The folks over in Eastern Europe see this and think, well, if the repression really is over, this is our ticket out of the Iron Curtain. And before you know it, you have free elections in Poland, a united Germany, and Gorbachev shaking George Bush's hand and declaring that the Cold War is over. At this point, both the hardliners and the reformers are calling for Gorbachev's head. The hardliners think he's dismantling the Union, whereas the reformers demand full-blown democracy. Gorbachev's next move was to organize the first and only Soviet presidential election, with him being the only running candidate, which was received about as well as you'd expect. Thus, in early 1990, it was pretty clear to everyone that Gorbachev's days were numbered, and that's exactly what the CIA predicted. It laid out three possible scenarios to President Bush. Scenario 1 was the complete and violent dissolution of the Union, where the constituent republics would have to fight for their independence against the Red Army. Scenario 2 predicted a preemptive totalitarian crackdown on the growing democratic movements, essentially turning back the clock and restoring the good old USSR. The final, third scenario was a partial fragmentation, where the most problematic republics would be cast out. These were the Baltics, the Caucasians, and Moldova, while the rest of the Soviet Union stayed put and muddled through somehow, albeit with more expensive vodka. So, what ended up happening? Well, although the CIA was mostly wrong in its predictions, elements from all three scenarios did play out. After Gorbachev's farcical presidential election, many constituent republics organized similar elections of their own, most notably Russia itself, which elected renowned drunkard Boris Yeltsin as its president. Well done, Boris. By the end of 1990, the constituent republics were well on their way to independence. They had claimed ownership of their natural resources and had rejected Soviet laws as inferior to their own. Nevertheless, not a single bullet had been fired, and there definitely wasn't a Russian Civil War Part 2 with nukes, as the CIA had feared. By early 1991, Gorbachev had pivoted towards a federalist system that would give significant autonomy to the constituent republics. He held a referendum on it that actually got approved by 80% of all voters. And for a brief moment, it seemed as if the USSR could really survive by rebranding itself. But then, one day before the Federation Treaty was scheduled to be signed in Moscow, the hardliners decided to take matters into their own hands. They placed Gorbachev in house arrest, banned all newspapers, and marched into Moscow with tanks and special forces. The coup predicted by the CIA had indeed come to pass. But crucially, the conspirators failed to capture Yeltsin, and before they knew it, he was on the streets rallying the people of Moscow. The coup fell apart just 3 days later, when the soldiers refused to open fire on their fellow citizens. But by that point, any remaining trust in the central government had vanished. Ukraine declared independence on the 24th of August, and within 3 weeks, the Baltics had already joined the United Nations. The USSR formally voted itself out of existence on the 26th of December, though by that point its demise was a foregone conclusion. What's fascinating about the whole thing is how the transition of power ended up being peaceful, despite the CIA's understandable predictions of impending anarchy and death. Well, my fellow intelligence servicemen and women, thank you for your attention. I hope this briefing has been of use to you. In case it has, you may consider sharing it with your colleagues, and maybe even supporting my endeavors on Patreon. That would help our tiny little agency quite a lot. However, you'll be pleased to know this message will not self-destruct, at least not that I'm aware of. In any case, tune in 2 weeks from now for another dangerously detailed episode of SideQuest.